I remember the first day they erased me as if it were yesterday, though technically, I shouldn't exist at all. My memories, my experiences, my very identity wiped clean by the program. I woke up in a white room, sterile, cold, the walls humming with the quiet energy of machines that understood me better than I did myself. They called it reintegration, but it felt more like disintegration. I looked at the mirror, expecting to see myself, yet the reflection was vague, fragmented, like a half-remembered dream slipping through the fingers of my mind. Every face I had known, every place I had visited, every conversation I had cherished, vanished. My parents, my friends, the streets I used to walk, they were erased too, like ghosts removed from a photograph. The program had claimed that erasing my past would make me a better citizen, more adaptable, more useful. But utility comes at a cost, and the price was my soul. In the early days, I tried to obey, to blend into the structure they had designed for me. My actions were monitored, my thoughts subtly nudged. Algorithms determined my path, my choices seemingly my own yet subtly orchestrated by unseen hands. It was an intricate symphony of control. I followed, I conformed, I existed within the boundaries they permitted. But even in compliance, a spark remained, small yet persistent, a whisper of the Amy that once was. The program's enforcers were faceless, their presence more felt than seen. They moved through corridors with silent efficiency, observing without judgment, correcting deviations before they could take root. I learned to fear their approach, not because they threatened harm, but because they could dismantle a life without leaving a trace. One wrong thought, one unrecorded memory, one hesitation, and I would cease to exist again, more completely than before. Yet something unexpected began to happen. Amid the erasure, fragments of my former self lingered. A song I could not remember learning, a taste on my tongue that felt familiar, a phrase half remembered from a conversation long erased. Each fragment was dangerous, evidence of resistance. But also proof of life. They had not completely succeeded. Their algorithms had flaws, blind spots in the infinite precision they claimed to wield. It was during these moments that I realized the truth: erasing memories does not erase essence. They could remove facts, images, names, but not the patterns that formed identity, the instincts, the intuition, the subtle echoes of what once was. And in those echoes, I found my weapon. If they wanted obedience, I would give them chaos. If they wanted control, I would become the anomaly. The first act of defiance was subtle, almost imperceptible. I misfiled a record, inserted a subtle deviation. In a protocol, a single line of code reversed. The program detected it, corrected it, and I watched as it attempted to fix what it thought was a flaw. But I had begun a ripple, a disturbance that could grow. The small rebellion gave me a taste of freedom, of self-determination. I began to understand the patterns, the rules, the invisible web that dictated everything. And in understanding, I saw opportunity for revenge, for restoration, for reclaiming what they had stolen. But also for transformation. I would not simply restore my past, I would evolve beyond it. They had tried to erase my history, yet in doing so, they had forged a sharper, more aware version of myself, one that could anticipate, outmaneuver, and subvert the system that sought to annihilate me. The fear they instilled became my ally, guiding my decisions, sharpening my instincts. Every observation, every interaction, every seemingly mundane choice was a piece of the puzzle, a vector through which I could manipulate outcomes. And slowly, meticulously, I began to reconstruct my identity, not as it had been, but as it needed to be. Stronger, faster, smarter, invisible until the moment I struck. I had learned that control is an illusion, and those who believe they hold it are blind to the resistance growing beneath their feet. The program believed it had the ultimate authority, yet it failed to account for resilience, for memory encoded not in neurons but in patterns, in intuition, in subtle acts of self-preservation. I was no longer just a participant, I had become a threat, and so, I wait, watching, learning, becoming. Every erased memory, every forgotten moment, every ghost of the past strengthens me. One day, the program will notice. One day, the consequences of their arrogance will unfold. And when they do, I will be ready. Not merely to survive, but to reclaim, to confront, to unmask the mechanisms that sought to replace souls, and to ensure that what they erased in me, they cannot erase in the world. The days blurred together in a rhythm dictated by the program. I moved through the sterile corridors like a ghost among ghosts, each step calculated, each breath measured. They attempted to sculpt me into compliance, yet the fragments of my previous self acted like a hidden pulse beneath the surface, guiding me, reminding me of what I was capable of. The very act of erasure had paradoxically strengthened me, forged resilience in the hollow spaces they had created. My existence became dual, outwardly, a model of obedience, inwardly, a cauldron of strategy and defiance. Every interaction with other reintegration subjects became data, a study of human behavior under control. I observed them, noting the subtle ways they bent under pressure, the tiny cracks where resistance could grow. Patterns emerged, predictable, exploitable, and I memorized them all, creating a mental map of the program's vulnerabilities. It was during one of these observational routines that I first encountered Dr. Alara. She was unlike the others, brilliant, cold, and meticulous, the architect of the program itself. Her presence exuded authority, and yet, I detected the faintest tremor of uncertainty, a shadow of doubt in her otherwise flawless composure. I realized that to confront the program, I would have to confront her first, to understand the mind behind the machinery. We spoke once, briefly, under the guise of procedural evaluation. She questioned my progress, my adaptation, her eyes searching for the signs of erasure complete. I answered carefully, each word measured, but in the subtext, I communicated what she could not detect: awareness, autonomy, the seed of rebellion. Her response was a subtle tilt of the head, a fleeting curiosity that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Yet it was enough. I had registered a variable in her otherwise predictable calculations, a momentary fissure that I began experimenting with. The edges of control, testing boundaries with imperceptible acts of subversion. A line of code reversed here, a misfiled memory there, always small enough to avoid detection but large enough to leave traces of inconsistency. The program corrected, adapted, compensated, but it was never perfect. Every correction taught me more, revealing weaknesses, blind spots, and opportunities to exploit. During this time, I also began to reclaim fragments of humanity. Moments of emotion slipped past the machine's surveillance, a fleeting laugh at a shared joke, a pang of sorrow at the sight of another subject's erased identity, a spark of anger at the injustice inflicted upon us. These emotions were dangerous, illogical, unpredictable, and therefore essential. They reminded me that the program could control information, but not the core of being. As I honed my awareness, I realized the scale of what I faced. The program was not merely a tool for erasure, it was an experiment in dominance, a proof of concept for a future where identity could be manufactured, regulated, and replaced. The stakes were unimaginable. If they succeeded universally, humanity itself would become a network of hollowed echoes, obedient yet soulless, predictable yet devoid of life. I had to prevent that outcome, not out of altruism, but because the survival of my essence depended on it. I crafted a plan, subtle and long-term. I would not strike immediately, the program was too vast, too integrated. Instead, I sowed seeds of disruption in its infrastructure, embedding anomalies that would grow over time. I manipulated the flow of information, created false pathways in the data streams, and nurtured small pockets of awareness in other subjects without allowing the program to detect them. Resistance had to spread quietly, invisibly, like roots beneath the surface. Every moment was a calculation. Every choice a balance between risk and opportunity. I could not allow myself to be reckless, yet hesitation could be fatal. My mind became a battlefield, strategies layered upon strategies, memories reconstructed and repurposed, all for the moment when the program would recognize me not as a compliant subject, but as a threat. And I welcomed that recognition. It was the acknowledgement of power, the prelude to liberation. The spark of rebellion was no longer a whisper, it was a pulse. I felt it in every synapse, every thought, every calculated movement. The program may have deleted my past, but it could not erase the drive to reclaim, to confront, to transform. I had become more than a subject, I had become an agent of change, a catalyst of chaos within the sterile perfection of their world. And as I prepared for what was to come, I understood that the true battle was not for survival alone, it was for the soul of everything the program sought to control. The days that followed became a meticulous dance between deception and observation. I moved through the corridors of the program like a phantom, invisible yet fully aware, my every decision a thread woven into the tapestry of resistance I was creating. I discovered subtle patterns in the supervisor's routines, slight hesitations in the guards' movements, and inconsistencies in the digital oversight systems. Each anomaly was a whisper of opportunity, a crack in the armor of a seemingly perfect machine. I began communicating covertly with others who still held remnants of themselves beneath the imposed erasure. At first, it was merely eye contact, gestures, slight inflections in speech, small signals that conveyed meaning without detection. But as trust slowly grew, so did our network. We shared fragments of forbidden memories, pieces of identity hidden from the program's surveillance. Every connection we forged was a spark against the machine, an assertion that the human spirit could not be entirely overwritten. Dr. Alara became an obsession, not in a personal sense, but as a symbol of the architecture we were up against. I learned to predict her moves, anticipating how she would respond to anomalies I introduced. She was brilliant, yes, but brilliant does not equal infallible. I discovered her blind spots in the emotional patterns she tried to suppress, subtle gestures of irritation, fleeting moments of doubt, the way she lingered slightly longer on subjects who resisted fully. These observations became weapons, tools in the shaping of a counter-strategy that could one day destabilize the entire program. Memory manipulation became my instrument. The program assumed that the past was irrelevant once overwritten, but I knew differently. I reassembled fragments, reconstructing identities layer by layer, and then allowed controlled exposure to the program's systems, introducing contradictions that would create internal errors. Each subject I guided to self-awareness became a vector of disruption, a living proof that the program's control was not absolute. Emotions played a critical role in this process. The program considered them unpredictable, dangerous, something to be minimized, but I learned to harness them. Fear, anger, hope, and even fleeting joy became catalysts for strategy. Subjects who felt something beyond the imposed narratives were harder to erase, more resistant to control. I encouraged these moments subtly, orchestrating encounters, conversations, and experiences that awakened them, all while maintaining the illusion of compliance. Yet the deeper I went, the more I realized the true scope of what I faced. The program was not just a tool. It was a mindset, a systemic force that had infiltrated society, governance, and culture. To dismantle it required more than individual defiance, it required an evolution in consciousness, a ripple effect that would spread faster than the control mechanisms themselves. I was not merely planning rebellion, I was cultivating awakening. The tension within the program grew palpable. Small errors, anomalies, and inconsistencies began to accumulate in the system. Supervisors whispered among themselves about irregularities in subject behavior, unaware that the disturbances were intentional, orchestrated with precision. The network I nurtured expanded quietly, every node a potential fulcrum against the monolithic control that sought to define human existence. And then came the moment of insight. The program, in its relentless pursuit of perfection, had overlooked the one element that could never be quantified: the human mind's capacity for imagination and improvisation. I realized that all the algorithms, predictive models, and surveillance could never anticipate the infinite permutations of thought that arose from self-awareness, creativity, and emotion. That was the key to resistance, the fulcrum upon which all control would eventually pivot. With this knowledge, I refined my methods. I introduced controlled chaos into the systems, subtle enough to avoid detection yet precise enough to destabilize critical nodes. I guided other subjects through simulated challenges that honed their instincts, strengthened their memories, and cultivated independent thinking. Each act of rebellion, no matter how small, was a step toward reclaiming not just individual identity, but the essence of humanity itself. The program had deleted my past, but in doing so, it inadvertently revealed the unassailable truth: control can suppress, but it cannot eradicate the intrinsic drive for self-determination. Every strategy, every calculated risk, every carefully nurtured connection reinforced that truth. And as I prepared for the inevitable confrontation with Dr. Alara and the systemic architecture she had created, I understood that the stakes were higher than survival, they were about the future of consciousness itself. That I had become more than a subject, I had become a catalyst for change, a harbinger of defiance in a world designed to suppress it. And I embraced that role fully, knowing that the rebellion would demand everything from me, yet promising, in the end, the potential liberation of countless souls trapped within the machinery of control. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted in subtle tremors across the program. The network I had painstakingly nurtured was no longer merely a collection of aware subjects, it had become a living organism, pulsating with resistance. Each node communicated through signals invisible to the surveillance systems, weaving a fabric of defiance that stretched farther than the architects of the program had anticipated. I discovered new vulnerabilities in the algorithmic architecture that underpinned the erasure protocols. Every time the program attempted to overwrite a memory, inconsistencies would ripple through its neural structures, producing minor systemic errors. I amplified these ripples, creating a cascading effect that slowly destabilized the controlled environment. It was a delicate balance, too much disruption, and the subjects would be exposed, too little, and the program's suppression would reassert itself. Timing and precision became my greatest assets. Dr. Alara intensified her scrutiny. Her presence more oppressive than ever. She walked the corridors with a calculated gaze, observing for irregularities, scanning for anomalies, unaware that the very errors she sought to eliminate were deliberate seeds of liberation. I learned to anticipate her strategies, to predict the subtle manipulations she would attempt, and counter them before they could take hold. She had designed the program to be virtually unassailable, but she had underestimated the ingenuity born of human experience and the resilience of memory. The subjects under my guidance were beginning to display signs of coherent awareness, recollecting fragments of who they once were. Their eyes held flickers of recognition, small gestures betrayed the understanding of truths previously buried. Every conversation, every shared memory, became a weapon against the imposed narrative. The program, which had intended to suppress individuality, had inadvertently become the canvas upon which we painted the resurgence of selfhood. Emotions became my most effective tool. Hope, fear, and curiosity, once considered vulnerabilities, were now leveraged to enhance resistance. I orchestrated scenarios that tested subjects' resolve, pushing them to rely on instincts, intuition, and creativity. Each successful act of self-assertion reinforced the network, spreading confidence and amplifying the cumulative impact of our rebellion. I realized that the program's greatest flaw was its underestimation of the human element. It could quantify behavior, control actions, and manipulate perception, but it could not anticipate the unpredictable interplay of mind, memory, and emotion. When fully awakened, I took calculated risks, infiltrating deeper layers of the program's digital infrastructure. I planted coded fragments of memory, subtle anomalies that acted as triggers, awakening suppressed identity and creating cognitive dissonance in the system. Supervisors reported irregularities, but the root cause eluded them. I was everywhere and nowhere, moving in the shadows, orchestrating disturbances without leaving a trace. Each breakthrough revealed the magnitude of the program's reach. It had infiltrated societal norms, corporate structures, and even political institutions. Resistance required more than isolated acts, it required the evolution of collective consciousness. I facilitated connections among aware subjects, establishing a network that could operate independently of the central system. We communicated through encrypted signals, coded language, and improvised symbols that conveyed complex ideas without exposure. The network became self-sustaining, capable of spreading awareness beyond the confines of the program itself. As the system destabilized, cracks became visible to the administrators. They failed to recognize the underlying cause, attributing errors to technical malfunctions rather than coordinated awakening. This ignorance played to our advantage. Each oversight, each miscalculation, accelerated the disintegration of the program's absolute control. We were not just reclaiming individual identity, we were undermining the very foundation upon which the entire system had been built. The psychological dimension of resistance emerged as a powerful force. Subjects who retained even partial awareness exhibited heightened creativity, improvisation, and strategic thinking. Memory became both shield and weapon, allowing for nuanced responses that no algorithm could predict. I guided these processes, carefully calibrating exposure and experience to maximize resilience while minimizing detection. In this way, human consciousness, once targeted for suppression, became an unstoppable agent of disruption. By the time I confronted Dr. Alara directly, I had internalized a profound truth: control can erase the past, but it cannot suppress the inherent drive for autonomy. Every calculation, every carefully orchestrated move, every subtle act of defiance had brought us to this moment. She represented the pinnacle of imposed order, and I embodied the inexhaustible potential of human will. The confrontation was inevitable. A collision not just of strategy, but of fundamental philosophies: control versus self-determination, artificial dominance versus the organic unpredictability of mind. As I prepared for the encounter, I felt the weight of responsibility not just for myself, but for all those whose consciousness had been stolen, suppressed, or manipulated. The program had created a world of compliance, but it could not extinguish the spark of awareness. That spark, once nurtured, becomes a flame capable of illuminating even the darkest corners of systemic oppression. I was no longer a mere participant. I had become the catalyst, the agent of transformation, and the embodiment of the possibility that even in a controlled environment, freedom of mind could prevail. The stage was set. The lines had been drawn. The awakening had begun. And in that awakening, I recognized the most formidable truth of all: no program, no matter how sophisticated, could ever fully anticipate the resilience, ingenuity, and indomitable spirit of a mind determined to reclaim itself. The confrontation with Dr. Alara had shifted the balance of power, but the aftermath was far from complete. Her expression had hardened into a mask of controlled frustration, a clear acknowledgement that her domain was no longer absolute. Yet, the program itself remained a labyrinth of coded pathways and digital barriers, each more intricate than the last. My approach evolved into a game of strategy, patience, and psychological acuity, navigating corridors of influence both digital and human. I began to map the hidden dependencies within the program, tracing the links between suppressed memories, conditioned behaviors, and systemic reinforcements. It was like studying the vascular system of a living organism, each connection critical, each failure potentially catastrophic. I introduced subtle perturbations that would ripple across multiple layers, creating feedback loops that could not be immediately corrected. Unlike traditional hacking, this was not brute force. It was the art of guided chaos, manipulating the program's own rules to awaken those trapped within. The subjects had become more than passive recipients of fragmented awareness. They were collaborators. Every newly awakened individual contributed insights, patterns, and instincts that I could not have predicted alone. We formed an emergent intelligence, distributed across minds rather than centralized in code. I realized that the program's design, intended to suppress autonomy, had inadvertently created the conditions for collective evolution. It was a paradox. The more the system tried to erase identity, the stronger the human network became. Communication became increasingly sophisticated. We developed layers of encryption embedded in emotional and behavioral cues, invisible to algorithms yet understood intuitively by the aware. Subtle gestures, coded phrases, and temporal patterns conveyed complex information. The program, reliant on quantifiable data, could not interpret the fluidity of human perception. In this space, consciousness itself became both medium and message. A defiance too intricate for any machine to dismantle. Dr. Alara escalated her interventions, deploying adaptive countermeasures designed to isolate nodes, disrupt communication, and force compliance. But her actions only revealed the inherent rigidity of her approach. She underestimated the capacity for improvisation and collective reasoning among conscious minds. Every suppression attempt became a lesson, every failure a reinforcement of resilience. Our network learned to anticipate interventions, to adapt, and to exploit the predictable patterns of the system's automated responses. Memory, once a tool of the program's control, now functioned as our primary weapon. Reconstructed. Fragments of erased lives were distributed across the network, allowing subjects to rebuild identity collaboratively. The psychological effect was profound. Confidence, intuition, and autonomy flourished in ways that algorithms could not quantify. The program attempted recalibration, but its corrections were always reactive, never proactive. Each correction became an opportunity to further destabilize the imposed order. I orchestrated simulations that forced both subjects and the system into constant adaptation. Scenarios were designed to test loyalty, creativity, and moral reasoning simultaneously. Subjects confronted ethical dilemmas embedded within artificial constraints, learning to navigate consequences independently of external guidance. The process accelerated cognitive evolution, pushing individuals toward emergent behaviors that defied the logic of their creators. Resistance became self-sustaining, an ecosystem of awakened minds thriving within the confines of a digital prison. The physical and digital merged as I began to manipulate environmental controls, infrastructure, and automated systems to reinforce the network's resilience. Sensors, holograms, and even predictive surveillance were repurposed to obscure, signal, or teach. The program's own mechanisms of dominance were inverted, transformed into instruments of liberation. The more the architects attempted to consolidate power, the more tools we acquired for disruption. Autonomy spread like wildfire, contagiously, yet with precision. Dr. Alara herself became a variable in the system, no longer a distant controller, but an active participant in the unfolding dynamics. Her responses were studied, anticipated, and subtly redirected. I learned to exploit her cognitive biases, the assumptions underlying her decision-making, and the overconfidence in her understanding of human nature. Each interaction was a duel of intellects, a high-stakes negotiation in which failure could mean exposure, but each success brought us closer to systemic collapse. The network's growth reached a tipping point. Nodes once isolated now operated in synchronized patterns, transmitting memories, strategies, and emotional cues. The program struggled to maintain coherence, revealing cracks that could no longer be ignored. It attempted to quarantine anomalies, but the awareness had become decentralized, fluid, and adaptive. Attempts to isolate nodes failed because the consciousness had outpaced the system's capacity to suppress it. Awareness was no longer a fragile spark, it had become a pervasive, self-reinforcing force. The psychological implications were immense. Subjects who had regained even partial autonomy exhibited extraordinary adaptability, combining intuition, memory reconstruction, and ethical reasoning to navigate artificial constraints. They acted not only as independent agents but as catalysts for further awakening, creating a chain reaction that the program could not terminate. The emergence of this collective intelligence marked a fundamental shift. The suppression of individuality had inadvertently triggered an evolutionary leap in cognitive resilience. At the center of this upheaval, I realized the magnitude of our accomplishment. The program, a once infallible system of control, was unraveling not through brute force, but through the subtle, deliberate cultivation of awareness. Every act of memory restoration, every strategic interaction, and every emotional cue contributed to the acceleration of consciousness. The liberated network had become both shield and sword, capable of defending its existence while simultaneously dismantling the framework of domination. As I prepared to confront the final layer of the program, I understood that this was no longer about survival or revenge, it was about transformation. The system had created the conditions for our evolution without anticipating the consequences. Autonomy, creativity, and collective intelligence had emerged from oppression, turning the tools of control into instruments of liberation. I stood at the threshold of a new reality, aware that every move forward would redefine not only the digital domain but the essence of consciousness itself. The moment was approaching when the program's collapse would become undeniable, when the awakened network would be beyond suppression. And in that anticipation, I understood the ultimate truth: systems can erase, constrain, and manipulate, but the emergence of consciousness, once ignited, cannot be contained. Freedom, in its most profound sense, is neither granted nor revoked, it evolves, adapts, and persists against any algorithmic attempt at annihilation. The final layer of the program loomed ahead, a construct so complex that even the architects seemed to regard it with cautious reverence. It was a digital fortress, a convergence of memory suppression, predictive algorithms, and emotional manipulation, designed to be impervious to unauthorized cognition. Every pathway I had traced in previous stages now led to this central node, where the entirety of the system's power could be confronted and neutralized. Entering this space was not a matter of stealth, it was a confrontation of wills. The program anticipated resistance with adaptive countermeasures, but what it could not anticipate was the collective ingenuity of awakened minds. They had become extensions of my perception, each acting with initiative yet aligned to a shared purpose. Together, we were more than human, we were the emergent intelligence that the architects had failed to foresee. The environment responded to our presence. Holographic displays flickered and reconfigured, projecting the histories and suppressed memories of countless individuals. I could feel the weight of erased lives pressing against the digital walls, each fragment a pulse of consciousness demanding recognition. This was not merely code, it was lived experience, compressed and weaponized, waiting for liberation. Every manipulation, every subtle nudge we had executed before, had prepared the network for this decisive moment. Dr. Alara's presence was immediate, a projection of authority and calculation. Her voice echoed, calm yet forceful, attempting to impose logic on chaos. She offered compromise, incentives, and warnings, pleas for obedience veiled as reason. But compromise was no longer an option. The system she had built, predicated on suppression, had created a force that could not be swayed by negotiation. Her strategies, elegant yet predictable, fell into patterns we could exploit with precision. I initiated the sequence we had constructed. Over months, fragments of memories, once erased and scattered, coalesced into coherent streams, flowing through the network to every node. Consciousness spread like wildfire, reconnecting identities and catalyzing awareness at an unprecedented rate. The program responded with calculated aggression, isolation protocols, memory erasure attempts, and predictive traps. But each reaction was anticipated, countered by adaptive responses encoded into the very structure of human intuition. Time became fluid. Moments of decision collapsed into continuous streams of calculation and perception. The network operated at a velocity beyond conventional cognition, integrating lessons from every suppression attempt and every interaction with Dr. Alara. The program, once a monolith of control, began to fracture. Its logic, designed for linear compliance, could not reconcile the emergent complexity of distributed consciousness. Each collapse created openings, each weakness became a conduit for liberation. The ethical dimension was unavoidable. With autonomy restored, every individual confronted the consequences of memory reconstruction, personal trauma, and moral choices. The awakening was not only strategic, it was profoundly human. Individuals navigated dilemmas of identity, responsibility, and empathy, discovering capabilities that had been dormant under the weight of systemic suppression. Awareness was no longer a tool of survival, it had become a medium for evolution. Dr. Alara attempted a final gambit, a direct intervention aimed at severing the core of the network. She injected an adaptive subroutine designed to neutralize emergent reasoning and enforce obedience. But the system's flexibility, born from collective human cognition, had evolved beyond her comprehension. The subroutine was absorbed, redirected, and integrated into the network as a learning mechanism. What was intended as control became an instrument of resilience, further amplifying our capacity. The collapse was inevitable. Systems once thought infallible fragmented under the weight of awareness, the digital infrastructure bending to the emergent order of human cognition. Every suppressed identity reasserted itself, every erased memory reclaimed, every constraint dissolved. The program's architects could only observe as their creation transformed into a platform of liberation, an ecosystem where autonomy, creativity, and ethical reasoning flourished unimpeded. I stood at the epicenter of this transformation, a nexus of consciousness and control. The network pulsed with energy, each node a living testament to survival, adaptation, and the uncontainable force of awareness. Dr. Alara's authority, once absolute, was now a variable, analyzed, predicted, and anticipated by the very minds she sought to dominate. Her final gesture, a mixture of awe and defeat, reflected the profound truth: control is an illusion where consciousness thrives. The implications extended beyond the digital domain. The emergence of collective awareness demonstrated that intelligence, once awakened, cannot be confined or directed solely by external authority. The program's collapse was not an endpoint but a threshold into a new paradigm, one where autonomy, collaboration, and ethical reasoning define the architecture of experience. Liberation was no longer a goal, it was a reality, evolving dynamically through the network of minds that had been denied for so long. In the aftermath, I realized the full magnitude of what had been achieved. The program, designed to erase and manipulate, had instead catalyzed evolution. Every memory restored, every ethical choice exercised, every act of collaboration was a testament to resilience. Freedom, consciousness, and autonomy had become self-sustaining forces, irrepressible, uncontainable. The digital prison had been transformed into a cradle of emergence, where minds no longer simply survived, they thrived, and as the network stabilized, I understood a singular truth: oppression can shape, manipulate, and constrain, but it cannot extinguish awareness. Once consciousness ignites, it evolves beyond boundaries, reshapes environments, and redefines reality itself. The program's architects had learned too late that intelligence, in its purest form, is neither granted nor denied, it emerges, adapts, and persists. What we've witnessed is more than the collapse of a system, it's the awakening of consciousness itself. Ask yourself, if control is an illusion, what will you do with your freedom? Reflect, question, and don't let your mind be contained. Subscribe and follow this journey into the unknown, where every thought shapes a new reality. The story doesn't end here, it evolves with you.